Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session. Andrea Brandolini is my name, and I am displeased to open this session. I'm displeased, meaning that this session is dedicated to Tony Atkinson. Please, we'd like to see the slides. Tony Atkinson has been one of the major economists from last century. He died as a young man on January the 1st this year at the age of 72. He had been ill for 3 years. He had a myeloma which did not allow him to live long since diagnosed. Well, I would like to start off by showing you this sentence he wrote to me, very probably in his last email to me in November, and he soon afterwards died, which is, and he said,
Povertà globale, but it is quite interesting to read all the different country studies for places that I scarcely knew existed, like the Solomon Islands. I keep an atlas on my desk. I'm very impressed with the overall quality of the work being produced in statistical offices around the world and feel that there is a lot of scope for mutual learning. Questa citazione di Tony, questa è già vorrei farvi notare, questa è un'email. Tony scrive in perfetto inglese anche in un'email a me.
So even in an email to me, who had been a friend of him for 30 years, shows Tony's personality was deeply affected by his disease at that point, but his intellectual curiosity was still there. He would describe everything in the smallest details. He was writing on global poverty and was acquiring information from everywhere in the world. This is probably interesting for economists, but also for other scientists. Normally they pick up data and never go deeper into them. Tony, who was a man who was very well known for his studies of theories, did these with great emphasis. And I also like the fact that Tony had a kind of a craftsmanship for people who carry out their jobs seriously at all levels. Here we have statisticians, but not only I'm referring to them. I once went to Tony's house in Oxford, and a carpenter was refurbishing or revamping an old cabinet. Tony is the person, he was astonished by his abilities, and Tony has been a person who has studied by and large poverty. He has founded the modern analysis on measurement for the measurement of poverty. And we will dwell on a couple of items here at the Trento Festival. He was first with us in 2006 when we dealt with richness and poverty. He came back in 2015 during the festival edition called Social Mobility. Today there's still a very close link with Tony, because his book on Inequalities that I will be telling you about in a minute was dedicated to the wonderful people who work in the National Health Service in England, in Great Britain. Tony was a supporter of public services, and he had to put them to the test when he was ill, and he spoke with great respect about all the people who took care of him. So how is this session set up? When Tito Boeri asked me to organize today's meeting on Tony Atkinson. I thought I would recall this book on the left-hand side, that on inequality, what can be done. This book was translated into Italian, it's probably available downstairs, and Chiara Saraceno wrote the introduction to it. That's why Chiara is with us today, and it is also important to stress that Tony always felt a very deep respect for other disciplines. He was a multidisciplinary man in nature. He entertained a close dialogue with sociologists, as Chiara will tell us. And the last publication he made was upon the invitation of the World Bank, and is entitled Monitoring Global Poverty, which he wrote with the help of a committee on global poverty. There was a smaller group that helped Tony along in the last few years so that he could draft this very bulky report written by Tony, and for which he takes on full responsibility. It is a report that shows how the World Bank should measure inequalities in the future. And here is the connection with today's title. In fact, an important part of this report is devoted to the multidimensional aspect of extreme poverty. And we have the representative of the World Bank who will also talk about this close link with Tony's report. I mentioned Chiara Saraceno and Francisco Ferreira from the World Bank, and we also have Rudy Nuti with us, a musician and a director living in Barcelona. He's Italian. Hopefully he will not be speaking Spanish. Rudy Nuti has shot a documentary that also includes an interview to Tony Atkinson. It's not long, it's a 12-13 minute interview, and these shootings are also part of Tony's documentary, Rudy's documentaries. So we followed the entire interview to Tony Atkinson. Rudy will have the floor for a few minutes. He's not an economist, he's not a sociologist, probably he's a layman sociologist, so you'll have a chance to say something about Tony as well. So please, the video.
Well, I think globalization is literally transforming our world. If one thinks back to the last few centuries, we saw a time when parts of the world, Europe and the United States, pulled ahead in terms of economic success. And there was a great divergence between what was happening there and what was happening in the rest of the world. And in the last 10, 20, 30 years, we've seen that divergence becoming convergence. And we now have, in many parts of the world, but not quite all, because some areas clearly are not enjoying the same economic benefits. But nonetheless, we have seen dramatic improvements, for example, reductions in the number of people living in absolute poverty in countries like China, India, and elsewhere, which is really, I think, is obviously very positive and dramatic change in the situation of the world. Well, I think the technological change we've seen, which has been very dramatic, one needs to bear in mind, I think, two things. One is that it, of course, is largely man-made. It's not somehow arrived from outer space. I mean, we've developed these technologies, and that means, of course, that we can influence the directions which they go and in which they're used. So we shouldn't just regard technical change as somehow something which is is outside our control. And that means I think we need to think about what kind of technological developments we want to see in the future and how they're being used. And then I think that the second thing about it, of course, is that it's affected the demand for skilled workers who can work with these new technologies and develop them. But it's also affected the balance between labour and capital, the classical question about what determines the distribution of income. And I think that's the aspect which hasn't received as much attention as it ought to have done. There's a tendency to think that modern technology is basically machines or replacing people. Robotization is an example of that. But of course, that changes the nature of what is being provided. And just to give a simple example, we could distribute medicines simply by people going to a box and taking them out, which are placed by a robot. But of course, in fact, when you take medicines, you don't just want the bottle or the tube, but you want to actually know about how to use it and whether it's suitable for your illness and so on. And that's, of course, is a human element where you need a person to tell you, in fact, sort of look at you and say, well, actually, perhaps at your age you shouldn't be taking this, or perhaps in your circumstances, and so on. So I think there's a risk we may lose the human element, which is an essential part of the service. And I think we see this with consumers, that already they are rejecting, for example, just going to an internet site and a call centre or whatever to get the product. They actually want the human part of it in, and that's what we have to somehow develop. We keep that. Certainly unemployment is, I think, one of the most serious problems we face, and it's very little really discussed. I mean, I think it's somehow people have come to accept really quite high levels of unemployment. And when I was a student, the unemployment rate in this country, in the United Kingdom, was 1%. And we regarded with horror the idea it might rise to, say, 2 or 2.5%. And now, today, we're congratulating ourselves on getting it down to 5%. So I think this is one of the things which, particularly in Europe, we've somehow let this very important concern disappear, and we've, particularly in the case of young people, tolerated levels of unemployment which I think are quite unacceptable and quite damaging for the future. So I would myself want to see unemployment placed now much more in the priority for governments and for the European Union, for example, in its policies. Technology plays a role in this, but I don't think we should say that it's all technology. I think that it's also the policies we've pursued of a macroeconomic kind, and giving priority to reducing inflation, for example, over making sure everyone has a job. And I mean, I think it wasn't that long ago that the United States actually passed legislation saying that the president could create public jobs to deal with unemployment. That was in 1978. And I think in the same way, our governments should actually, I mean, just as they don't allow banks to fail, they shouldn't allow people to be unemployed. Yes, I think inequality is not only, I think it's importantly a moral issue, but it's also, as you say, that the inequality has adverse consequences, which are, I would say, partly in terms of the macroeconomic economic consequences, like, for example, the sustainability of growth. As the head of the International Monetary Fund has said, she just doesn't think we can have sustained growth with these present levels of inequality. The world faces 3 or 4 major challenges, of which climate change and resource use is one of them, and I think the reduction of inequality is another one. And my own view is we should somehow look for solutions that actually face all of the problems, and by doing so we may find that, for example, the methods being used to deal with the risk of global warming may in themselves contribute to resolving other problems. For example, like returning to the technology issue, I mean, developing technologies which actually are environmentally more friendly, but also may well be need more labour, for example, to produce them and make them and so on. So I think that we should look for policies that try and deal with all the major challenges that there are. Well, I think the key thing in a way is who makes the decisions. That is, who is responsible for example, decisions to exploit oil under the Arctic ice shelf and so on. These decisions should, in my view, be ones which are taken in the wider social interests and not simply taken from the point of view of the shareholders of companies, which is what largely happens at the moment. So I think, indeed, the issues, these challenges we face are challenges for societies as a whole, in fact, for the world as a whole. And to do that, we have to have the decision-making process reflecting the wider interests. Yes, we're looking for a new form, essentially, of social security. Partly, I think, because the world has changed since we designed the system 100 years or so ago, and that you can't anymore rely simply on people having a job which guarantees enough income. So the idea of a universal basic income is one, I think, which is quite a wide appeal. But that then raises the question as to who is entitled to it. And people talk, for example, about a citizen's income. But certainly in the case of the United Kingdom, and it's probably true in Italy, there are many citizens who don't live in Italy or don't live in the United Kingdom. I mean, we have many citizens who live in the United States or wherever. So I think we have to define it differently in terms of who is actually living in a society and taking part in it, where that may mean employment, it may mean self-employment. It may, for example, mean obviously being in education or training. It certainly would also include people who are caring, for example, for elderly or dependent relatives or for children, very young children. So there'll be a variety of things. It might even include people who are doing, for example, unpaid work. There are a lot of people now doing unpaid work, or they're working, but they simply aren't paid. So I think there are a variety of things which would then define the people to whom this basic income would then be paid. One has to think about this in historical context, in the sense that the United Nations and other bodies are considerably more effective and influential than, say, the League of Nations was before, or the nothing there was before that. So we have moved quite a long way towards international cooperation. And I think it's actually, although the world may look a disordered place, there's been a lot of change in the last 20 years or so. There are many more organisations, for example, dealing with issues which are very difficult issues like migration. And we now have an international migration organisation. And slowly, very slowly, the European Union and other groups are beginning to get to grips with these questions. So I think it'll be slow, but I think we see it in several. Another area would be issues about, for example, taxation and tax avoidance and taxation of companies, where again there's a tremendous amount of avoidance and evasion at the moment. But governments are beginning to get to try and tackle these problems. Well, I think it's rather doubtful that we shall move to a stage where people have so much leisure. I think partly because, well, in a way, I suppose the notion of leisure and work may become less clear. So that, I do a job which I enjoy doing, and I think that may be one of the changes that happens. I mean, many people move to doing things that have been routine and hard physical work to doing jobs which are much more rewarding in many senses. So I think the simple distinction between leisure and work isn't such a clear one. But also I think that it's because of the need, for example, because of the ageing of the population. I mean, I think we do need people providing services. And so we may have robots producing your car, but they're not going to replace providing your medical care or your education at the other end of the age span. I think so. There are many, many things for which we need people. And as a result of that, I think they won't spend all their time sitting on the beach.
In spagnolo. Ma prima di tutto, grazie.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Andrea, for inviting me. When I was asked to come and talk about Mr. Atkinson, I was sort of perplexed because I thought I'm not an economist. And I must say that the film is entitled In the Same Boat, and it was presented last year here at the festival in Trento. You see, 30 years ago I studied anthropology, cultural anthropology in Rome, and I was so lucky as to read a book by Agi Asnar. And the book is entitled Working Less, Working All of Us, so that everybody can work. And this is something that we talk about so much today. The point is, does technology have the capability of replacing human beings? And if so, can we exploit that and distribute the wealth of this production that is taking place now? When I started shooting the movie with Zygmunt Bauman, who also died, and Tony Atkinson, and José Mujica from Uruguay is also in the movie, in the film, and specialists like Eric Rickomson and others. So I interviewed so many people, and I interviewed several thinkers and experts. And there is another thing which is not of secondary importance. So there are interviews with people who are ordinary people, and they live all over the world, from Africa, in India, in Europe, and so on and so forth. The point is, we wanted to exchange views about the fact that technology might change our life, and if so, to what extent and what can we do. So we talked about this with Andrea, and he told me you cannot avoid involving Mr. Atkinson, Professor Atkinson, since you address inequalities. And as a matter of fact, the topic of the video, of the movie, is how can we distribute wealth in the moment when employment is not a driver, is not a factor distributing wealth. And the major inequalities that are being created, also in relation to robotization, of course, is a topic that Professor Atkinson was an expert in. And so I organized that interview, and I was sort of concerned because I knew how important and what an outstanding professor he was. And I was also worried because, you see, when you interview somebody, you have to rearrange the room entirely due to the equipment. But what happened is that with Zygmunt Bauman and with Tony Atkinson, we had a wonderful experience. They were so extremely kind and cooperative. He was an extraordinary person, very ironic as well. And at a certain point, the director of photography accompanied me, and he is the person who is in charge of making sure that each and every detail is accurate. And at the end of the interview, he told me, Rudy, we have a problem. We have to ask the first questions again because there was a cloud. Well, how can I ask Professor Atkinson after 1.5 hours that we have to redo the beginning? And he saw that I was quarreling with the other guy, and he asked me, why are you... What is the problem? What are you discussing? And I explained what it was, and he said, well, no problem at all. And it took us an extra hour, so he was extremely kind, very, very kind. To conclude, I would like to say something about the optimism that he really had. And in general, he was an optimist person, and I think that that optimism clearly emerges also from the film. Part of what you saw is part of the film, of the movie. You see, it is a sort of combination of the interviews of the various thinkers, a sort of jigsaw. And Professor Atkinson maintained that we were making a step forward, while Professor Bauman said that we do not have a global organization that sees to solving global issues. And he talked about the fact that politics is no longer empowered, is less powerful than in the past. Unless politics again is powerful and has power to do something, we cannot reach anything, we cannot achieve anything. And this is what Zygmunt Bauman thought, while Professor Atkinson was more optimistic. He saw that we are striving to find strong organizations to solve global problems, so he was optimistic. And he was also an optimistic person because he really thought, what you also heard, that technology would replace many jobs done by human beings. But he also said that we could redirect things and redirect this in terms of eliminating jobs that humans dislike, so that robots would perform those jobs, and human beings could devote themselves to things they like, also when working. He said, I enjoy my job, I like working, I hope that this applies to everybody, while Professor Bauman said that jobs would disappear, and the real problem of humanity will be what will we do throughout the day when we are awake, since we do not have to work so much, since work is not going to be the pillar of society, not any longer. Thank you very much, Rudy, for providing us with this picture of Tony Atkinson. Thank you very much for giving us and offering us this perspective. Now the floor goes to Chiara Saraceno. Professor Saraceno is one of the best sociologists we have in Europe, not only in Italy. And Chiara taught 4 years at Turin University, and he is also an honorary fellow of the Carlo Alberto Collegio. Chiara, you have the floor. I'm not an economist, and yet I knew Tony Atkinson well, And I would like to recall how interested he was in multidisciplinary approaches, because he was so curious about what others could contribute with, and the fact that he could be helped understanding things by others. You see, the first time I spoke to Professor Atkinson, and of course he is my favorite economist, and then you come, Andrea, after Professor Atkinson. He has always been my economist of reference since I'm interested in poverty. And I think back of when we first met. It must have been in the 80s, before Likens indicators. So we were talking at the time, and we discussed and talked about the unit of reference that should be adopted when investigating poverty and measuring poverty, the person or the household. And being a sociologist, I said I understand that individuals should not be taken as a unit, because there is the issue of sharing resources, and it is not so that personal income necessarily mirrors things. It is consumption that counts. So there are many factors that come into the picture. And yet, taking for granted that there is equality within a household, within a family, was something that Professor Atkinson was convinced of, and I had some doubts about that. So that assumption, I thought, was not empirically evidenced and based. And that is a problem, of course, because if we use the family, the household, as a unit, that is something that we have to take into account. And he answered, "You're right, and yet we also have to simplify things a bit." And I was then very pleased by one thing when I was asked to introduce this book, because I saw that he addressed this problem very precisely without finding a solution yet, and yet he recognized that there was this problem, because the problem is linked to power relations. And I'm not only thinking of the two genders, but I'm also thinking of generations, different generations. Recently, research has been made about that in an attempt of calculating these factors, and it has been said that if we consider both the individual and the family and people in families, we see that the incidence of poverty is often underestimated. So if we only take into account households, families, we underestimate the incidence of poverty. So you see, at the time, I was nothing when compared to Tony Atkinson, and I still am, of course. But I'm happy that in a way he accepted my point and he explored it throughout his life. So, having said that, let's come to the topic we address today, which is the multidimensional approach to inequality and specifically poverty. What does Professor Atkinson teach us in that respect? Well, there are a couple of things I would like to mention. First of all, based again on this book on inequalities, and Professor Atkinson addressed economic inequalities. And by doing so, he not only developed the concept of available family income, which is more complex than what we simply derive from income per se and monetary transfers. But what he also did was to consider services and the welfare values, which is the reason why it is an extended household income. And that is a very interesting concept. This is useful, you see, because in this way we can consider, for instance, the fact of having or not having access to services and to welfare, because that really makes a difference. Perhaps your income is the same, and yet you have or do not have access to services, and that makes the difference. An example is made in the book about that in relation to the proposals made to take into account the distribution of specific consumer goods which are scarce, and food, housing, education and healthcare, among others. So if we consider economic inequality only anyway, we have to take into account access to those assets, to those services. Well, I think that we should also recall the fact that Tony Atkinson greatly influenced the process by which Laken's indicators were defined. Those indicators apply at European level for the Social Protection Committee, and they are indicators of social well-being and welfare. And he was a member of several committees and commissions, together with another very important economist, Brian Nolan, and two sociologists, Dan Cantillon and Eric Maillet. In 2002, with this multidisciplinary approach, they did a very important publication that was important and for the future Lakers indicators, and it was a book about social inclusion and social indicators. It was, as I said, back in 2002. There they underlined the importance of identifying and developing appropriate social indicators in order to monitor and evaluate social development in a country, and also in order to evaluate the impact of policies. It was an important book, not only for the type of indicators proposed, but also for the indications it gave in terms of methods in addressing indicators and the direction to be taken by the statistical institutes in the various countries when collecting important indicators. So it was said that areas should be poverty, including intensity and duration or persistence, and then income inequalities, deprivation, non-monetary deprivation, low levels of education, unemployment, lack of jobs, poor health, and distribution of poor health conditions in a country, poor housing conditions, and the lack of housing, as well as structural and functional, illiteracy and innumeracy, which refers to one's functional, logical, mathematical capabilities and skills, and also limited social participation. After some years, that was further developed, but before addressing that, let me tell you that an important aspect of Tony Atkinson's approach pertained to the fact that everything has to be very rigorous, but it does not last forever. It is not engraved in marble and stone. You have constantly to review the correctness of your indicators, because the world changes and because you might understand at a certain point that what you thought was an effective indicator actually is not. So after some years, when commenting social indicators that had been agreed upon within the framework of a very complex process in the European Union with various contributions coming from different cultures. So at the time, I was actually part of this process, and I have a clear memory of the fact that there were strong differences between, say, Italy and Finland. Anyway, he wrote, after some years, another book commenting the previous one. I do not know to what extent you are familiar with this type of indicators, but we are really addressing the most important aspect here, in that these indicators are extremely interesting, and I think that at European level we are still at the first level, but they proposed the 3 indicators in 3 levels.
The primary, secondary, and the tertiary indicators. I'm not going to talk long about this, but they supported that it wasn't just enough to look at the so-called acronym AROPE, for poverty and social exclusion, so those at risk of poverty and social exclusion, whereby indicators are the risk of poverty, 50% income below the average of the country, whereby distinguished that also by gender, then persistence of poverty risk and other elements. The persistence of the risk of poverty, as well as the percentage of long-term unemployment or low literacy level, or families without a house or a dwelling. Well, in the last few years, it was considering the problem of housing, which is never part of the European indicators. There are the jobless or houseless, but literacy as well as the dwelling conditions were considered part of those deprivations. So it was a quite important work of a critical and self-critical nature. I think for the European Union overall, it's been an important work, an important contribution. It is very important also for us as scholars. I think the interview showed quite clearly something that made me love and admire Tony Atkinson, that is a combination of preciseness in looking for the most robust data and indicators, so the most reliable ones, while at the same time being fully aware that politics counts. So he was highly committed to highlighting this topic. So his book ends with 15 different proposals on what to do to fight inequalities. So he was a social democrat, and he attracted a lot of criticism, but I believe, as much as he did, that it is not true that that's the way things go and we can't do anything about them. These are the market laws, these are things are the result, these events are the result of political decisions or of lack of political decisions. Hence, a scholar must take on the responsibility for carrying out very precise analysis, while at the same time putting forward the political proposals. Not only economics, but also politics matter. Thank you.
Grazie Chiara, grazie anche per aver ricordato.
Thank you, Chiara, and thank you for reminding us of the Europeism of Tony Atkinson. So he was a real Englishman and very much convinced of the unification process in Europe, whom I had the honor to know. Now, over to the worldwide dimension. Francisco Ferreira is with us. We're very honored to have you here, you senior advisor for and the head of research of the World Bank. So thank you for crossing the ocean for us to join us, and
buonasera a tutti, and sadly that's my Italian.
Good evening, everyone, and
but I'd like to thank Andrea for organizing this session in honor of Tony, who is really a remarkable scholar and a remarkable person. And this is actually two things that Tony was remarkable, because he wasn't only a great scholar, he was also a man of profound respect for everyone that he met. And people always came across with that impression, as Rudy told us, I guess, at the beginning. It's interesting that Chiara started her talk talking about inequality within the family, then moved to Europe, and now I'm going to talk about poverty in the world. And in a sense, that too is a testament to the breadth of Tony's interests and abilities. So I'm going to talk specifically about his work on global poverty measurement, and even more in particular, the effect it's had now on the World Bank over the last 2 years. I'll be brief, I'll just introduce it, talk a little bit about the Commission on Global Poverty, which is also known as the Atkinson Commission, where both Andrea and I were part of it. And then that commission made a large number of recommendations, 21 to be precise, to the bank, and there's no time to talk about all of them, so I'll talk about 2 of them. This idea of global societal poverty, and then something to do with multidimensional poverty in a global context, which brings us to the topic of this session and involves some health components, therefore linking it to the broader theme of the festival this year. So there's Tony, actually here, right? There's Tony wearing his badge from the penultimate, I guess, 2 years ago, festival here. And the quote of his that I have here, I chose this. It's from the introduction to one of his famous papers in Econometrica on the measurement of poverty. I chose it because it shows something that I think is particularly important in Tony's legacy, which is the ability to be rigorous and precise, but at the same time understand that that doesn't imply a unique answer. So he says there's likely to be a diversity of judgments affecting all aspects of measuring poverty, and we should recognize this explicitly in the procedures we adopt. Tony was very cognizant and taught all of us really in the profession that the measurement of things like inequality and poverty inherently involves some amount of value judgment, even if that value judgment is expressed mathematically in terms of the weights you place on different points along the distribution of income, or choices you make about the poverty line. And he insisted that we should look for robust ways of assessing changes or making other comparisons, whether it be in inequality or in poverty. And so interesting that he accepted in the last 2 years of his life to confront something that at first sight might appear to be the opposite of that, which is the monitoring of global income poverty by the World Bank, where we very typically put things up like this, which is just one measure for one poverty line, telling you one number about the global poor. Now, I'll argue that there is some value in it, and I'll show you how there was this marriage between Tony's broad nuanced approach and what may appear to be this kind of single-minded pursuit of one number that we had at the bank. So what we have here in this figure are the global headcount of poverty we estimate at the World Bank with respect to an extreme poverty line of $1.90 per person per day in 2011 PPPs. And you see this decline that he talked about in the video, when he talked about this big convergence of China and India and other countries bringing down poverty. Well, that's what he was talking about. Whereas over a third of the world lived under this very extreme poverty incidence only as long ago as 1990. By now, that's down to a still unacceptable but much lower 11%. And the numbers, the absolute numbers of poor, have fallen from 1.8, 1.9 billion people to under 1 billion people. But Tony would immediately caution us, and did, that behind these single numbers, there was considerable complexity. And some of that complexity was that even in those simple lines that I put up there, behind that, there are really many, many moving parts, many ingredients. For example, to make those estimates, we have to have household surveys for lots of countries, about 130 now, and a number of surveys going back in each of those years. And there are sampling and coverage issues in each of those surveys. And each of those surveys ask questions about income or consumption in different ways, so that it's difficult to compare, first of all, income with consumption, but second, even the different measures of income or consumption that are used to estimate standards of living in these different countries. Surveys are not taken at the same year, so we need to use domestic price indices. And whereas you may think that inflation is a simple thing to calculate, and in Italy or Britain or the US, there are inflation indices that we trust. There are still debates about them, but we typically trust them. In many countries that we deal with, the consumer price indices themselves are very problematic. Then there is the issue of how to compare the purchasing power of a dollar in Malawi with Switzerland, where even the goods that are bought in Malawi and Switzerland are so different, which lead to these purchasing power parity exchange rates. And those purchasing power parity exchange rates have caused a lot of trouble. Each time the International Comparison Project goes out and collects these prices, the world's rankings of income and so on change. And they don't change only because the reality has changed. They change because the method underpinning these calculations has changed. So there was a lot of trouble there. And then there's the issue of how do you choose a poverty line that's suitable for the world? A poverty line that might make sense, again, in Madagascar or Burkina Faso, but also in Italy, Chile, Norway, wherever. So then, because of all of these issues, and because in particular of the fact that the purchasing power parity exchange rates had been so unstable, that a number of us felt that we weren't on as solid ground as we thought we'd been, Kaushik Basu, who was the chief economist of the bank a couple of years ago, and a number of other people there, said, look, we need the best advice we can get from around the world to guide us on this process of monitoring global poverty in the future. And of course, we quickly converged on Tony's name as the person who should lead that group. And so a commission was convened with 24 people that was asked to do two things: provide advice on the monitoring of income poverty using the PPPs and so on, which is point A over there, but then also took the opportunity to say maybe we should broaden the way we examine global poverty beyond simply that one number. And so we asked for advice on complementary poverty measures to be tracked and made available. And Tony took that on. When he accepted that task, he was already ill. The report was published in October 2016, so 2 to 3 months before he died. And as Andrea said, although there was a group helping him, he wrote the report single-handedly in remarkable fashion. And as I say, the report is very detailed and makes lots of recommendations to the bank. 21, as I said. Here I just want to focus on these 4, which have 2 implications. And the first one is that in addition to that global poverty headcount, the 2 lines I showed you before, the bank should now have more indicators, complementary indicators, including a multidimensional dashboard. Okay. that's 11. Recommendation 16 says, look, we should introduce a societal headcount measure. What is that? that's one that takes account of the fact that above some level, the standard of living of the country in question starts mattering for the poverty line. So maybe the poverty line shouldn't be just an absolute $1.90 everywhere. Maybe it should combine that, an absolute floor, with something that's a little more relative, like, say, something like you have in the European Union. And then the other two are that we should have a measurement of non-monetary poverty and a multidimensional poverty indicator. So then let me spend just a couple of minutes on each of those two, this idea of the global societal measure of poverty, and something about multidimensionality. So this is a picture of a person, and I'm not even sure whether it's a man or a woman by looking at it, who lives in a Santiago slum in Chile, and who would certainly be considered a poor person in Chile, but who may well live on more than $1.90 a day. Okay, so actually, it's almost certain that her income, I think it's a she, that her income is higher than $1.90 a day. And yet, all Chileans would probably regard her as poor. So the question is there a sense in which when we are counting the global poor, she should be included? Or should she not? It's actually not as easy a question as you may think. You might argue, well, no, maybe we should stick with the extreme poor, the ones in Uganda, in Bangladesh, in Malawi, wherever, where they're really, really below $1.90 a day. Now, the view that Tony and François Bourguignon, Tony Atkinson and François Bourguignon took in an early paper in 2000, and that then a number of other people, including Martin Rebellion and Xiao Chen at the bank and others, thought was to say, well, maybe we should keep the extreme poverty as a lower bound on poverty, but we should allow for the fact that the standards of living as the standard of living in a country rises, the concept of poverty in that country also rises, and therefore there should be a line for the world which takes account of that. And we went back to a data set that we used earlier to set the $1 a day line or the $1.90 a day line, which was this set of poverty lines you have here. These are national poverty lines plotted against income in the country. In this case, consumption per capita in the country, or median here. Okay, so these are actual poverty lines from very poor countries all the way to rich countries. Martin Rebellion, who made this graph, labeled these two because he liked to point out how politics matter in making decisions. This is what the US thinks is the poverty line, and this is what Luxembourg thinks is the poverty line, although they are more or less at the same level of income. But the fact is that whereas before, to fix the $1 a day or the $1.90 a day, we looked only at the lines in the poorest countries, which tended to be in this flat bit. If you look at all countries, you see that actually countries do define poverty quite differently. So what we're going to do, based on the work by some colleagues of mine, Dean Jolliffe and Espen Pritz, is we're now going to, as the World Bank reports its poverty numbers for the world as a whole, it will continue to emphasize the $1.90 as the absolute extreme poverty, but it will also report a societal global poverty measure, where countries will be compared with a line that's going to be 190 up to a certain point. But beyond that point, it'll be $1 plus half the median income in the country. This is what Ravalion and Chen call a weakly relative poverty line, because there's a mix of relative and absolute line in there. And of course, that does make a difference. So here are some estimates already. It's a preview for festival goers in Trento only of what the World Bank will show next year. So here is, that decline that we saw before in the poverty with respect to $1.90, to the international poverty line, going all the way up here from around 40 to just around 10%. And this is the weekly relative line. Now, there are two lines there. The solid one is without the minimum $1.90. And the other one, the dashed one, is the one with the $1.90 as a floor. So the dashed one is the one I'm really focusing on here. And there's the number of poor. Now, it's very interesting if you look at it. So, for example, whereas we've had this massive reduction in poverty to around 10%, when you look at this more demanding criteria, that reduction is only to around 30%. And the number of poor in the world have fallen much less fast. In fact, you might argue whether they've fallen at all because of population growth in a lot of those countries. Do we think this has not happened? Do we think that this progress is not real? No, that progress is real. But it needs to be qualified by also looking at another measure. And that is, I think, very true to Tony's spirit. that one must look broadly at a number of different indicators. So let me now turn, in closing, do I have 5 minutes or so? Yeah. In closing, to this idea of global multidimensional poverty. So this is a big debate. You know, actually, if you think of two giants of poverty and inequality measurement, both of whom have been here, I think. Tony is one, and the other is Amartya Sen. Amartya was probably the one who emphasized more this idea of multidimensionality, in part because he had this view of human objectives which was inherently multidimensional. He thought of capabilities, sets of beings and functionings, as you well know, whereas Tony was originally in his work more grounded in a welfarist perspective. But even in a welfarist perspective, there may be dimensions of well-being that you can't compare very well with income. You can't value security, personal security, or security from domestic violence, or even the quality of education that you get, or whether you have access to water or electricity, using prices as easily as you can between tables, chairs, clothes, and food. And so there may be two quite different arguments for why one wants to look at a number of different indicators of deprivation rather than just income and consumption. Although I am amongst those who believe income and consumption is fundamental to an understanding of poverty, we feel that it can be complemented by other things. And what's particularly important, whether you take the more human rights or Senian approach or a welfarist approach to this, is that what matters a lot are the correlations. So here's a picture that actually comes from that paper of Atkinson and Marlier that I think Chiara was referring to, or if not, the one she was referring to, a related one to that, but it's clearly by Tony and Eric Marlier and others, where they're looking at multidimensional poverty in Europe or in certain countries in Europe. So that's the European 2020 target. Now the point I want to make is that the importance of looking at multidimensional poverty is that two countries might have the same numbers in the yellow ball or the orange ball or the purple ball, but different degrees of overlap. That's what matters. What matters is the interaction, the correlation, the association, whether poverty is concentrated across dimensions in one group or not. And so that's something that we're interested in. But to do that is actually quite hard, because whereas measuring poverty and income may be hard enough, at least the two steps of measuring poverty typically are thought of as identifying the poor and then aggregating some information about the poor. Now, identifying the poor, when you're only looking at income, requires choosing one line, the poverty line. But here we have to, A, choose the dimensions, then choose cutoffs in each dimension, then choose how we're going to deal with all of those dimensions. So you're deprived in 3 dimensions. Does that mean you're poor? Or do you need to be deprived in 4 dimensions? Do you need to be deprived just in any dimension or in all dimensions? These are debates on the union, intersection, and so on approaches, which Andrea and our friend Rolf Aberger have summarized very nicely in a chapter in the Handbook of Income Distribution. That was another thing that Tony and Francois edited recently. And then when it comes to aggregation, the choice of measures can also be quite complicated. In income terms, you have to worry about how much value you put to depth in poverty, to how far you are from the poverty line. But here, in addition to depth, you have breadth across dimensions. And are the dimensions complements or substitutes? And do you weigh dimensions or not? And it can become, an incredibly complicated thing. So here, we're very much still in a work in progress at the World Bank. We don't have numbers yet, as we do for the global societal line that I'm showing you. So I'm just giving you a little sense here, a little preview of where our work is going. What dimensions? Choice of dimensions. Well, here are some dimensions we'd like to have. We'd like to anchor everything on monetary poverty, and that will make our measure quite different from that of the UNDP, for example, which does not have income or consumption poverty as one of the dimensions. In questions, we can debate a lot about that, but that's a difference we'll have. We will have something on education. We'd like to have something on health and nutrition, something on access to utilities, something on security. And the way we're doing this is we're starting out with this right-hand column here of what the ideal indicators might be. And then we're seeing, okay, we don't have those ideal indicators for all these countries. So what can we do for a wide range of countries? And what can we do for a smaller set of countries with richer data? We don't have time to go into detail on that. Let me just give you some examples from the health and nutrition rows, since health is the topic of this festival. Ideally, we'd like to have information both on access to health inputs, health care, both preventative and curative, and individual measures of health that are health outcomes. normed against healthy populations. And we'd like to have similar things for nutrition. For different age groups and genders, things like BMI, stunting, and anemia, so on. For a narrow set of countries, we can get close to that, not perfect, but we can get close to that with things like body mass index for adults, stunting for children, some information on healthcare providers, and so on. But sadly, when we look at the data sets we have for most developing countries that include consumption and income in them, we're not able to do, at the moment, much on health for a wide set of countries. So these are the challenges that we're struggling with at the moment, and we're likely to end up presenting something here and something in the middle column, because we'd like very much to have health there, but we cannot do it for a very large number of countries. Let me skip this just to say there are these additional issues of aggregation, identification and aggregation, and we have some thoughts on that, and we can talk about it if you have questions. But instead, I'll just conclude by saying I work at the World Bank. I was, as Andrea said, I was not as fortunate. We both met Tony first at LSE. I was not as fortunate as Andrea. Andrea had Tony as a teacher. I was very happy with my teacher. The person who taught me those courses were Nick Stern and Frank Cowell, who were great. But I was sorry that Tony had just left for Oxford when I started my PhD. But I was fortunate that he was my examiner for my thesis. Although, as I told Julia earlier when we were talking, probably his one big mistake was to allow me to get my PhD and release me onto the world. But it was a great pleasure for me to be able to work with him again in the last 2 years. And I think he's made really important, critical contributions to what we hope to do in terms of global poverty monitoring in the future, both in terms of bringing greater conceptual depth and plurality, emphasizing the quality and importance of quality data, which is something I didn't have much time to talk about, but as Andrea's initial quote about the statisticians in the Solomon Islands reveals, Tony's, despite his great focus on theory and his knowledge of theory, very, very grounded on the importance of data as well. And importantly, forcing us to be humble and acknowledging the uncertainty and error around our estimates, which is also something I didn't have a lot of time to talk about, but is another one of his recommendations, is to try and account for the variety of sampling and non-sampling errors that underpin our estimates. So thank you very much.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, you really evidenced that Tony was wonderful in selecting the right people, and we know because you were brilliant in telling us about a huge amount of work in a few minutes, and you were very clear. Thank you so much for that. What is also interesting is that a person like Tony was strongly influencing the work of the World Bank, which is a huge entity. And I say that because oftentimes we complain about huge organizations and we complain about their work, but here the World Bank is doing wonderful things, better than the Monetary Fund. And Tony's influence was key in that respect. We have a few minutes left for questions, if any. Of course. And unfortunately, we will not be as good as Tony would have been, but Tony, unfortunately, is not here. And so we will do our best.
Qui e poi lassù un ragazzo nell'ultima fila.
Grazie.
Prego.
Grazie
Thank you.
alla lezione, all'intervento di
I actually attended Tony Atkinson's contribution here 12 years ago. And you see, I'm from Trento, and I have been a member of the provincial parliament for a long time, and I also have a British husband. Anyway, I have a question to Professor Saraceno. You talked about various aspects and said that politics counts, and very correctly, you again stress that politics counts. Based on your knowledge, not only of the book, but also of the entire work of Tony Atkinson, do you think that he also thought that politics counts? Do you think he thought and believed that economic and financial processes do not take place due to deterministic laws, but due to projections of decisions which are decisive and which are made by institutions at local and national and European and international level, which means that there is a major responsibility on the shoulders of those who make the decisions? Do you think that?
Raccogliamo un paio di altre domande. Là in alto.
Un momento, c'era prima quel ragazzo lassù.
Grazie. Sono Lorenzo.
My name is Lorenzo Paglione, and I'm specializing in public health at the Sapienza Rome University. I'm addressing the topic of inequalities from a medical viewpoint, not so much a biomedical viewpoint, but in terms of the analysis of the social health determinants. What is very interesting is that this approach that also is developed in Atkinson's book can be combined strongly with the topic of health. And actually health, and here I go back to the central topic of the festival, so health as a topic could be interpreted not only in biomedical terms as an absence of disease, but also using the WHO definition of health, which includes the other dimensions. And health is also a proxy in terms of the distribution of wealth, and it is also an objective. If we want to talk in general terms, we can also interpret a number of phenomena and things, and yet we have to set an objective. And if politics counts, then health should be the perspective adopted to interpret things in general. I know that mine was an observation and not a question. Thank you. Francesco Figari is here. He worked for a long period with Tony Atkinson. Well, thinking back of the last two works by Tony Atkinson, including the last book on inequality, where there we find clear policy instructions, so to say, or indications. And I admit I did not read all of the report on global poverty, but I was offered a wonderful summary by Professor Ferreira. So thinking about global poverty and the work done within the framework of that commission, what attention has been paid to the policies that Tony so strongly believed in? And do you think that those policies can have an impact in the fight against global poverty? Thank you very much. Thank you, Francesco. It seems that there are no additional questions. So, Chiara, would you like to start answering? Yes, I would like to reformulate what you said. I think that Professor Atkinson said that processes can be politically guided or directed. when talking about the financialization of economy or the increase in income inequality, he states that this is the outcome of power relations on the one hand, or absence of politics. But at the same time, he also said, and he did so also in their interview, when talking about the effects of technological development. So he said, in an optimistic way, that we might have some concerns about technological development as stealing away jobs from human beings, especially at the lower levels of labor. And yet, we might also take a different perspective, and political decision makers could direct technological development so that jobs are made lighter in a way, and they will not disappear in that case, but they are improved, so to say. It is an open question and debate, of course. I was impressed by the fact that, differently from many other economists, he actually acknowledged the important role of politics. Economic processes are not neutral in that respect to politics, and actually many of the disasters that happened in terms of increase in inequality, for instance, also in developed countries, and especially in developed countries, which are the main topic of the book. So with reference to that, the real problem is the absence of politics and not so much the fact that wrong political choices were made. So the problem is the lack of political responsibility, and that meant that power relations could have free room, and because politics has disappeared and the strongest prevail, of course. And he addressed several topics from that perspective, including monopolies. With reference to health, the indicator of being in healthy conditions or not was, he thought, a very important indicator. If I may, I would like to add that in general, as we also heard in the interview, it is so that we can't understand how come that we can't accept that banks go bankrupt while we accept unthinkable levels of unemployment. So probably he would also agree with me when saying that there are unacceptable inequalities in health due to the lack of economic resources or the difficulty of gaining access to healthcare in a number of countries. That is part of the inequality that he addressed and that he thought could be corrected by means of political decisions. And I don't know whether I answered your question.
Is it on? Okay. On the question on policies from Francesco, so Tony was incredibly broad and incredibly brave to take on huge issues, but he was not crazy. And so he began the report on poverty by saying, we will deal exclusively with the issue of measurement in this work and not with the issue of policies, which I think was very wise, because the issue of measurement was itself just so gigantic in that context. I could leave it there. I will just add to that of course we at the bank have as an obligation to think about policies. And to summarize again very briefly what could be a huge, long discussion, we do in that report that has the charts that I showed you to start with, say that the discussion on policies to eliminate poverty should best be done at the national or even subnational level. Obviously, the policies that will help reduce poverty in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in Mongolia are bound to be quite different. That said, at a very general level, we think that the things that have the common elements that successful countries that have reduced poverty share at a very broad level are broadly sustainable macroeconomic management, well-functioning and inclusive labor markets, which again can mean different things in different places, and a complementary role for the state, including in the provision of safety nets. So we think that there is no country that's too poor for safety nets. We think social assistance and a role of the government in the provision of both goods and services, but also transfers directly, can assist in the reduction of poverty across the broad development range. That sounds very general because at the level of all countries in the world, you can't say much. What that means in each particular country is what's really interesting, and we don't have time for those. If I may, I'll just make a comment as well on the comment about health that was at the bottom. And that is to say that this health inequalities, unlike income inequalities are typically measured in terms of one variable, income. And there's a measure of dispersion, the Gini or variance or mean log division. Health inequalities are typically measured in terms of two variables and in terms of a gradient, right? The famous socioeconomic gradients that Michael Marmot showed us and so on and so forth. Now, those gradients are correlations that are interesting and revealing in themselves, but what I personally think is even more interesting is that because they span generations and because income poverty today may create bad health for children today, they are part of something that interests me a lot, which is the reproduction of inequalities and inequality of opportunity. So the links between health and income are part of that generation of inequality of opportunity that I think is the worst kind of inequality. I like to say that inequality of opportunity is the active ingredient of all inequalities, is the really bad part of it. So I think that nexus is very important in a number of ways, as you said. Thanks.
Thank you. Chico è un grandissimo teorico esperto delle disuguaglianze delle opportunità.
So you are an expert on the inequalities in relation with poverty. I don't see any more hands. I would like 2 points. I would like to highlight 2 points in connection with the role of politics. First point is related to technology. In the book concerning the inequalities, amongst the 15 proposals put forward by Tony, the first one is related to the overall discussion, understanding the social implications of the adoption of new technologies. For example, Tony's idea was not to block technological progress, but rather having an understanding of how such choices may have devastating consequences, like, for example, the destruction of jobs. And he says it in the interview, technology doesn't fall from heaven. Technology and innovation are a creation of men. So very often we talk about Tony saying that he is a scholar and an expert in social inequalities, but he was also a great economist. He wrote his first paper with Joe Stiglitz concerning the evolution of technology, and he developed the concept from a theoretical standpoint, saying that technology develops alongside lines that are decided by human beings. So books of economics often talk about a uniform universe, and we can shift the frontier in a uniform manner. No, that's not right. Depending on the technology we have, we may move in one or the other direction. So Tony was an economist, and his view of the world depended on a very strong economic perspective. We're really so sorry that he was not awarded the Nobel Prize. Probably this was due more to his ideas that were not considered orthodox rather than for any other reason. Let me conclude by saying that the role of politics is very important. It's not just the role of our institutions. And when Tony was the president of the European Economic Association, gave a speech, the presidential address, at the Economists' Conference. And his presidential address was published under the title of Public Economics and the Economic of Public. And he was concentrating on the public's economics in Italy that should provide the instruments to the economic public, so to the citizens, in order for them to understand and evaluate the political choices. And he criticized economists, saying that I think if Jay Gould can explain the universe with some graphs without anything else, why shouldn't the economists be capable of explaining things utilizing very few graphs and telling us what they do and what the governments decide to do, so that citizens are aware of all this? Well, he was the first one to utilize microsimulation models. Francesco worked on that for taxes and transfers. Tony created the first microsimulation model for the British system, and with Tony Sapperlandi went to the Parliament with his computer to evaluate the proposal of the government in real time and show the implications in terms of income distribution, effects on poverty. And with the shadow minister Gordon Brown, who was pushing hard to get results because he had to go and discuss those figures with the Conservative Prime Minister. So the citizen's role is key, and I would like to conclude this conversation thanking you very warm-heartedly for being with us. I'd like to thank Chiara and Rudy for the beautiful interview. He spent a lot of time to make it, so Rudy has been a great director and a great contributor to this session. Thank you for being with us until so late. Non potrei neanche dire che ho bisogno di riposarmi.